She doesn't even have a lawyer." Alexander Whitmore said it into a microphone in front of every camera in that courtroom, with the satisfaction of a man announcing a verdict he had already bought. Then he turned to face Emily directly and laughed, not quietly, not privately, but openly, the way powerful men laugh when they are certain no one can touch them. His 4 attorneys laughed with him. Half the gallery followed. Emily stood at her table alone, no briefcase, no counsel, no one beside her. Alexander leaned toward his lead attorney and said loud enough for the room to hear, "This is already over." He had never been more wrong in his life. If this story moves you, please subscribe to our channel, follow Emily's journey all the way to the end, and drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. The morning of the hearing, Emily Whitmore woke before sunrise. She didn't rush. She didn't panic. She sat at the edge of the bed in the apartment she had moved into 6 weeks earlier, a furnished rental on the east side of Manhattan, with thin walls and a radiator that clanged every hour through the night, and she placed both palms flat on her knees, the way her mother had once taught her to do when she needed to feel grounded. "Feel the floor under your feet," her mother had told her. "As long as you can feel the ground, you are still standing." Emily pressed her bare feet against the hardwood and breathed. Then she stood up, dressed herself with care, and walked out the door to face the most important day of her life entirely alone, or so it appeared. What Alexander Whitmore did not know, what no one in that building knew yet, was that Emily had not been idle during those 6 weeks. She had not been crying in a rental apartment, eating takeout, and watching her former life collapse on the television news, the way Alexander had assumed. He had told his attorneys that Emily would break down within 2 weeks. He had told his business partners that she would call begging for a settlement before a courtroom date was ever set. "She's soft," he said at a dinner in late November, swirling wine around a glass that cost more than most people's rent. "She always has been. Give her 2 weeks without her credit cards and she'll sign whatever we put in front of her." Alexander was wrong about that. He was wrong about nearly everything when it came to Emily. But he had never bothered to find out how wrong he was, because in the 10 years they had been married, Alexander Whitmore had made one consistent and catastrophic error. He looked at his wife and saw exactly what he wanted to see: a quiet woman, a grateful woman, a woman who owed him everything and knew it. He did not see who she actually was. Emily had arrived in Alexander's life at 31, after the sudden death of her father had pulled her away from the career she was quietly and brilliantly building. She had studied economics at Harvard, graduated in the top 4% of her class, and spent the early years of her career at a boutique investment firm in Boston, where her colleagues respected her, and her instincts were almost always right. She had a talent for seeing patterns in data that other people missed. She had a calm that made her devastating in a negotiation room. She had the kind of mind that worked faster than it appeared to. And then her father died and everything shifted. She had flown home to New York for the funeral and stayed for 3 months because her mother Victoria was managing the grief alone and Emily could not leave her. And it was during those 3 months that she met Alexander at a charity event in the city, a tall, confident man with a broad smile and an easy laugh who told Emily on their second date that he had never met anyone like her in his life. He meant it then. She believed him. And that belief was the beginning of the longest education of her life. She married him at 33. By 35, she had stepped back from her career to help Alexander manage the expansion of his business empire into European markets, work that she did mostly from behind the scenes, mostly without credit, and entirely without compensation. By 38, she was no longer a businesswoman in any official capacity. She was Alexander Whitmore's wife, and in the world, Alexander moved through that title was both a definition and a limitation. "You're my partner," Alexander used to tell her early in their marriage when they would sit together late at night reviewing financial reports, Emily pointing out risk structures that his own analysts had missed. "I couldn't do this without you." She had believed that too. The first time she understood she had been wrong, she was 40 years old, sitting in a conference room in Alexander's corporate headquarters during a meeting with a new set of investors from London. She had prepared the analysis they were reviewing. She had spent 3 weeks building the financial model that was currently displayed on the screen at the front of the room. And when one of the investors turned to Alexander and said, "This is extraordinarily sophisticated work. Who put this together?" Alexander had smiled and said, "My team, they're the best in the business." He had not looked at Emily once. She had sat in that chair and kept her face perfectly still the way she had trained herself to do over the years, and she had filed what she felt into the part of herself where she stored things that hurt too much to examine in the moment. That folder had been filling for a long time. The first real crack came 2 years before the divorce. Emily had suggested carefully and privately that Alexander consider restructuring the board of one of his holding companies before a regulatory review created complications. She had studied the filings for weeks. She had identified a pattern of overlapping directorships that would draw scrutiny and had prepared a detailed memo outlining the exposure. Alexander had dismissed her in front of 2 of his senior executives. "Emily," he had said, not unkindly in the tone a person uses when they are speaking to someone who cannot possibly understand what they are talking about. "The board structure is fine. You don't need to worry about this." "I have read the filings," she said quietly. "I know you think you have," he said. And then he turned back to his executives and continued the conversation as though she had not spoken. She had been right. 14 months later, the regulatory scrutiny came exactly as she had predicted, and the restructuring that followed cost Alexander's company $11 million and 6 months of legal work. He never acknowledged this to her. She never reminded him. But that was the day she understood something she had been resisting for years. Alexander did not dismiss her because he had evaluated her judgment and found it wanting. He dismissed her because listening to her threatened something he needed to believe about himself. He needed to be the only brilliant person in the marriage. He needed her to be grateful. And she had spent 10 years making that easier for him than it should have been. The first time she said the word divorce out loud, she said it to herself, standing alone in the kitchen of their penthouse apartment at 7 in the morning while Alexander was still asleep upstairs. She said it quietly. Then she stood in the silence that followed and waited to see how it felt. It felt like the first honest thing she had said in years. She did not say it to Alexander for another 3 months. She spent those months doing something that Alexander would never have expected. She gathered information. She made phone calls. She had quiet conversations with people in the financial world who had worked with Alexander's companies over the years and who had their own complicated feelings about the man. She read documents. She took notes. She built slowly and methodically the way she had always built things when she was working at her best, the architecture of what she would need. And she called her mother. Victoria Harrington had been in Emily's life in a particular way for the last several years of her marriage. They spoke regularly, visited when they could, and maintained the careful closeness of 2 people who love each other deeply, but have agreed unspoken and by mutual understanding not to examine certain things too directly. Victoria had never told Emily to leave her marriage. Victoria had never criticized Alexander directly in Emily's presence, not because she lacked opinions about him, but because she understood that a woman has to arrive at her own conclusions on her own timeline, and any interference would only delay the journey. But when Emily called her mother on a Tuesday evening in March and said without preamble or softening, "Mom, I need to tell you what's been happening," Victoria Harrington sat down, folded her hands, and listened without interrupting for 47 minutes. When Emily was done, there was a pause. "Are you ready?" Victoria asked. "I don't know," Emily said. "Maybe. I think I have to be." "That's not the same thing," Victoria said, "but sometimes it's enough." They did not discuss what Victoria intended to do. Emily did not ask, and Victoria did not offer, because that was the nature of their relationship, built on a bedrock of trust that had been tested many times over the years and had never once failed. 3 weeks later, Emily told Alexander she wanted a divorce. The conversation lasted 9 minutes. Alexander was not surprised. He was not hurt. He was not angry in the way a man is angry when he has been blindsided. He was calm in the particular way of a man who had already anticipated this possibility and prepared for it. And that calmness, Emily realized as she watched him, was its own kind of cruelty. "Fine," he said. "I'll have my attorneys call you." "I'll be ready," she said. He looked at her for a moment with an expression that she could not entirely read. It might have been contempt. It might have been something else. Then he nodded once and left the room. By the next morning, he had frozen every joint account. By the end of the week, he had had her removed from the list of authorized users on 2 properties they jointly owned. By the following Monday, she received a formal letter from his legal team, a firm with 12 partners, and an address on Park Avenue outlining what Alexander was prepared to offer in the divorce settlement. The number was insulting. It was designed to be. It was the opening move of a man who believed that control of money meant control of everything, and that without access to funds, Emily would eventually agree to whatever he decided she deserved. What he had not accounted for was that Emily had spent the previous 3 months learning in specific detail the actual financial architecture of the empire she had helped him build. She knew where the accounts were. She knew how the holding companies were structured. She knew which transfers had happened in the 90 days before he filed, and she knew what those transfers looked like to someone who understood what they were looking for. She had not gathered that information carelessly. She had gathered it the way her mother had always taught her to gather anything that mattered patiently, precisely, and without announcing herself. The 6 weeks between her departure from the penthouse and the first hearing had not been weeks of collapse. They had been weeks of work. She had not hired an attorney from any of the firms Alexander's people might be watching. She had done her own research, made her own calls, and had one very long and very specific conversation with her mother that had ended with Victoria saying quietly, "I'll be there." Emily had not told anyone what that meant. She was not sure entirely that she believed it would work. She was not sure that it would be enough, but she understood as she sat in the courtroom that morning watching Alexander arrange himself with the confidence of a man who believes the outcome of the day has already been determined, that she had at least one thing he did not. She had the truth, and she had prepared herself to use it. The hearing began at 9 o'clock on a cold December morning, and the courtroom was fuller than Emily had expected. There were reporters in the gallery because Alexander Whitmore's divorce was a story that certain publications had been circling for weeks, drawn by the name and the money and the particular drama of a billionaire's marriage ending in public. There were colleagues of Alexander's she recognized from events over the years, faces she knew from dinners and charity galas and business conferences, people who had always been pleasant to her and now sat watching with the careful neutrality of individuals who had not yet decided which side would be useful to them. Alexander arrived with 4 attorneys, all of them precise and expensive-looking, carrying briefcases and folders and moving around him with the coordinated ease of a team that had prepared this case for months. Emily arrived alone. She sat at her table, placed her hands flat on the surface in front of her, and looked forward at the bench where the judge would sit. She did not look at Alexander. She did not need to. The moment the judge entered and the hearing began, Emily watched Alexander's lead attorney, a man named Richard Caldwell, who had been practicing corporate law for 30 years and whose face registered a particular kind of barely concealed triumph, stand up and present the opening framework of their case. He spoke about Emily's lack of professional contribution to the Whitmore business enterprises. He spoke about Alexander's singular vision and leadership. He spoke about the settlement offer that had been extended, which he described as generous, and he spoke about the absence of legal representation on Emily's side of the room, with a tone that suggested this absence was itself evidence of the weakness of her position. "Mrs. Whitmore," the judge said, looking at Emily with the measured expression of someone who had seen a great many unexpected things in 30 years on the bench, "you are not represented by counsel this morning." "I am waiting for my representation, Your Honor," Emily said. Her voice was steady, quieter than she had expected it to be, but steady. "I was told they would be here by 9:15. Alexander leaned toward Caldwell and murmured something. Caldwell nodded. Alexander turned toward Emily with a small and satisfied smile. "Your Honor," he said, not waiting to be recognized because Alexander Whitmore was a man who was accustomed to speaking whenever he chose to speak, "my wife doesn't have legal representation because she understands at some level that this case has only one possible outcome. She is here out of obligation. I would suggest the court proceed." The judge looked at Alexander with an expression that said clearly that he had not asked for that commentary, but he did not respond. He looked at the clock on the wall. He looked back at Emily. "We'll allow a few minutes," he said. Those few minutes lasted exactly 4, and then the courtroom doors opened. Emily heard the sound before she turned to look. It was the specific sound of heavy wooden doors being opened with purpose, not rudely, not dramatically, but with the decisiveness of someone who had somewhere to be and was arriving there on her own terms. She turned. Her mother walked into the courtroom. Victoria Harrington had dressed simply, which was the only way she ever dressed. A dark coat well cut but not showy, A leather briefcase old enough to have character. Her silver hair was pinned back from her face in the way it always was, and she walked the length of the courtroom aisle without looking at anyone until she arrived at Emily's table, where she placed her briefcase down with a quiet firmness and turned to face the bench. "I apologize for the slight delay, Your Honor," she said. "Traffic on the bridge." She said it the way a woman says something when she intends it as both an explanation and a statement of presence. "I am here now, and we may proceed." The judge looked at her. "And you are Victoria Harrington," she said, "counsel for Emily Whitmore." The silence in the courtroom was instantaneous and complete. Then Alexander laughed. It was the laugh of a man who cannot quite process what he is looking at and has defaulted in the absence of another response to amusement. "Victoria," he said, "Emily, you brought your mother." He looked around the room as though inviting the gallery to share in what he clearly believed was the most satisfying confirmation of everything he had predicted about this divorce. His wife, without resources, without allies, without any real comprehension of what she was up against, had shown up to the most consequential legal proceeding of her life with her elderly mother and an old leather briefcase. "Your Honor," he continued, addressing the judge directly, now his voice carrying the easy authority of a man who had addressed many rooms over many years, "I want the record to reflect that my wife's only legal support today appears to be a retired woman from upstate New York who hasn't practiced law in over a decade. I think this speaks to the seriousness with which Mrs. Whitmore is approaching these proceedings." Two of his attorneys allowed themselves small smiles. One of the reporters in the gallery made a note. Victoria Harrington did not react to any of it. She removed her coat, laid it carefully over the back of the chair, and opened her briefcase. Then she removed a document and placed it on the judge's table, and the judge picked it up, and the expression on his face changed in a way that was visible from every seat in the room. "Mr. Whitmore," the judge said, and there was something different in his voice now, something that had not been there 30 seconds earlier. "Before we go any further, I want the record to also reflect that the woman standing before this court is Victoria Harrington, founder of Harrington Global Holdings, senior partner emerita of Harrington and Associates, and unless I am significantly mistaken, one of the foremost trial attorneys this country has produced in the past 40 years. He set the document down. He looked at Alexander. "Bar status current," he said. "Licensed in New York, California, and the District of Columbia." Alexander's face did not fall all at once. It was a slower process than that, more complicated the way a building doesn't collapse in a single instant, but begins to lose its structure from the inside before anything visible happens on the surface. He looked at Victoria. He looked at the judge. He looked at Emily, who was looking at her mother, with an expression that held something no one in that room had seen on her face since the morning began. Hope. Not the fragile kind. The deep-rooted kind, the kind that had been there all along, waiting to be seen. Victoria turned then to look at Alexander. She did it without hurry and without performance, simply turned her head and looked at him the way a person looks at something they have been studying for a very long time. "You made an assumption this morning, Mr. Whitmore," she said. Her voice carried effortlessly in the quiet courtroom. "You assumed that my daughter arrived here without support. You assumed that a woman who wasn't making noise wasn't doing anything. And you assumed that being loud about what you had meant that no one else had anything." She placed another folder on the table. "I'd like to enter our first exhibit," she said to the judge. And Alexander Whitmore, for the first time in the hearing, had nothing to say. Emily pressed her feet against the floor under the table. She breathed. She felt for the first time in what felt like years the specific solidity of ground beneath her. She was still standing. She had never stopped. And the most important fight of her life had not ended when Alexander assumed it had. It had in fact just begun. The records that Victoria had placed before the judge were detailed, meticulous, and organized with the precision of someone who had spent her entire career understanding exactly what a court needed to see, and in exactly what order it needed to see it. There were account transfers, there were corporate filings, there were dates and numbers and signatures that told a story in the specific and irrefutable language of financial documentation. A language that Emily had spent the last 3 months learning to read all over again. Not because she had ever forgotten it, but because she had spent 10 years pretending she had, and it was time to stop. Emily looked at the folder her mother had opened. She recognized the documents. She had helped find several of them. And for the first time since the morning began, she felt something shift in the room. The reporter in the third row stopped writing. Alexander's lead attorney leaned in and said something to his colleague in a voice low enough that the words were not audible, but the urgency was. And Alexander Whitmore, the man who had walked into this courtroom 4 hours earlier with the absolute confidence of a person who has already decided how something ends, looked at the document the judge was holding and became for just a moment very still. Emily watched him. She did not look away. She had waited 10 years for this day. She had not known for much of that time that she was waiting. She had believed on certain dark and honest mornings that she might never arrive anywhere that felt like solid ground again. But she was here now. Her mother was here. And the story Alexander had written about her, the story in which she had no power and no allies and no understanding of the world, she had actually helped him build that story, was about to be replaced by a different one. The true one. And it was only the beginning. The laughter died faster than Alexander expected. That was the first thing he noticed. One moment the room had been with him, the easy consensus of powerful people who had decided which side of history they were standing on. And then Victoria Harrington had opened her briefcase, placed a single folder on the judge's table, and the laughter stopped as though someone had reached across the room and turned off a switch. Richard Caldwell, Alexander's lead attorney, was the first one on his team to react. He leaned forward in his chair and narrowed his eyes at the document the judge was holding, trying to read it from across the room, and whatever he saw or didn't see made him pull his legal pad closer and begin writing something in quick, sharp strokes. Alexander noticed that too. He had worked with Richard Caldwell for 11 years. He had watched the man operate in boardrooms and courtrooms and private mediation sessions, and he had learned to read Caldwell, the way you learn to read weather, not from what the man said, but from what his body did when he thought no one was paying attention. And right now, Caldwell's body was doing something Alexander had not seen it do in 11 years of working together. It was recalibrating. "Your Honor," Caldwell said, and his voice had shifted by 3 degrees into a register that was slightly more careful than it had been 60 seconds ago. "Before we proceed with opposing counsel's exhibits, we'd like to request a brief recess to review the credentials being presented." "The credentials are current and verified," Victoria said without looking up from the second folder she was opening. "Bar license renewed 14 months ago. Trial certification active. I can provide the confirmation number if that would be helpful." She said it pleasantly. That was the thing Emily would remember later, how pleasant her mother sounded in that moment, the way a person sounds when they are so completely certain of their ground that urgency would be redundant. "That won't be necessary," the judge said. He set the document down and looked at Caldwell. "The request for recess is denied. We'll continue." Alexander put his hand on Caldwell's arm. "What is she doing?" he said quietly. "I'm trying to determine that," Caldwell said, and his voice was level, but his pen had stopped moving. What Victoria was doing, Emily knew, was exactly what she had said she would do during that long phone call in March, when Emily had laid out everything she had gathered in the 3 months since she first said the word divorce to herself in a quiet kitchen at 7 in the morning. She was telling the truth. She was telling it in the specific, organized, irrefutable language of documentation, the kind of language that courts understand and that emotional arguments cannot compete with. And she was doing it with the calm of someone who had been preparing this case not for 6 weeks, but in a certain sense for years. Because Victoria Harrington had not been idle during Emily's marriage either. That was the thing Emily had not fully understood until her mother explained it during their March conversation. Victoria had watched. She had noted. She had maintained quietly and without announcement a file of her own built over years of careful observation of things that did not add up, of transfers that didn't align with the public financial reports of corporate structures that seemed designed to obscure rather than organize. She had not interfered. She had told herself, and she had told Emily in a voice that carried 10 years of discipline in every word, that she would not interfere unless Emily asked. Emily had asked, and so Victoria had arrived. "Your Honor," Victoria said, and now she did look up, and she looked directly at the judge with the focused attention of someone who has been building to this moment and knows exactly how long it has taken. "I'd like to begin by introducing into evidence a series of financial transfers executed by Alexander Whitmore between the months of January and October of this year." She placed 3 documents on the table. Specifically, she said, "I want to draw the court's attention to the movement of approximately $430 million from 3 of Mr. Whitmore's domestic holding companies into a network of offshore entities incorporated in the Cayman Islands, Gibraltar, and the Isle of Man. The room did not erupt. It contracted. That was the better word. The way a room contracts when something is said that changes the atmosphere of it, when the air itself seems to pull inward in response to information that reorganizes everything around it. Caldwell was on his feet. Your Honor, this is an ambush. We have had no opportunity to review any of these alleged documents. We object to their introduction without prior disclosure. They were filed with the court clerk at 8:47 this morning, Victoria said. Prior to the commencement of this hearing, you had 43 minutes. She looked at Caldwell for the first time. I apologize if that was insufficient. She did not look sorry. Alexander stood up. This is ridiculous, he said, and his voice had changed too, the easy authority replaced by something that had edges in it. These are private corporate transactions. They have nothing to do with the divorce. They have everything to do with the divorce, Victoria said, still addressing the judge, because under New York equitable distribution law, assets transferred for the purpose of reducing the marital estate prior to filing are subject to recapture. And the transfers I am describing occurred in every case within the statutory look-back period. She paused. In some cases, they occurred within days of Mr. Whitmore's decision to file. The judge picked up the first document. He did not speak for a long moment. Caldwell turned to his colleague and spoke in a voice too low for Emily to hear. The colleague pulled out a phone and began typing rapidly. Alexander stood with his hands on the table, and for just a moment, the composure he had walked in wearing that morning showed its first real crack. Not in his face, not in any dramatic way, but in the stillness of him, the specific stillness of a man who is working very hard not to show what is happening inside his chest. Emily watched him. She had watched him for 10 years. She knew his stillness. She knew what it meant. He was afraid. She had never seen that before, not once in 10 years. And the recognition of it did not give her the satisfaction she might have expected. It gave her something quieter and more complicated, something that felt less like victory and more like grief. The grief of understanding finally and completely that the man across the room had never been who she believed he was, and that the marriage she had mourned for the past 6 weeks had never entirely been real. She pressed her feet against the floor and breathed, and let the grief move through her without stopping. She had work to do. Mrs. Harrington, the judge said, setting the document down, these are significant allegations. I want to be clear with both parties that this court takes seriously any evidence of deliberate asset concealment. I am ordering both legal teams to submit full financial disclosure within 15 business days. In the meantime, I am placing a temporary freeze on any further asset transfers by either party pending review. Alexander turned to Caldwell with an expression that said clearly, and without words, "Fix this." Caldwell straightened and addressed the bench. Your Honor, Mr. Whitmore has always maintained full transparency with respect to his financial holdings. These allegations are a litigation tactic designed to prejudice the court against my client. We would ask that the documents be reviewed by an independent forensic accountant before any freeze is implemented. That request is granted, the judge said. I'll appoint the accountant. The freeze stands while the review proceeds. It was not everything. Emily knew it was not everything. But it was enough for today, and the expression on Alexander's face when the judge said the freeze stands was enough to tell her that it mattered. Alexander sat back down. He was already on his phone texting with 2 fingers in the way he always texted when he was managing something that required immediate attention. Caldwell was reviewing the documents Victoria had submitted, his face giving away nothing, now the professional mask firmly back in place. Victoria sat down next to Emily and placed a hand briefly on her arm. How are you holding up? She said quietly. I don't know yet, Emily said honestly. Ask me in an hour. Victoria almost smiled. That's the right answer. The recess the judge called lasted 20 minutes, and Emily spent most of it in a small anteroom adjacent to the courtroom with her mother going through the next set of documents they intended to introduce in the afternoon session. They sat close together at a narrow table and spoke quietly, and Emily was struck not for the first time that morning by the particular way her mother worked efficiently, without waste, focused entirely on the next thing that needed to be done. Victoria had always been like this, even when Emily was a child, when something difficult was happening in the family. Her mother's response to difficulty was not to mourn it, but to move through it, to find the next right action, and take it without drama or delay. Emily had spent years of her marriage wishing she had inherited more of that quality. She had not understood until very recently that she had. "There's something I need to tell you," Emily said during a pause in their review. Victoria looked up. "I found something 3 weeks ago," Emily said. "I wasn't sure if it was relevant. I wasn't sure if I was reading it correctly." She pulled a folder from the pile between them. "I've been looking at the business Emily Whitmore contributed to for 10 years. Not the public companies, the holding structures underneath them. The ones Alexander's name is on, but that I spent 8 years helping to manage." Victoria took the folder and opened it. Her expression did not change, but her eyes moved across the first page with a speed that told Emily she was reading it very carefully. "Where did you get this?" she said. "I built it," Emily said, "from the corporate filings, from the subsidiary reports, from documents I had legitimate access to as a named officer of 2 of those holding entities until Alexander had me removed from both boards the week after I told him I wanted a divorce." She paused. "He removed me from the boards. He didn't think about what I had already read." Victoria looked at her. "Emily," she said. "I know," Emily said. "This isn't just evidence of asset concealment," Victoria said. "This is a pattern, a systematic pattern over at least 4 years." She turned to the second page. "Do you understand what this means?" "I think so," Emily said. "It means this isn't just a divorce anymore." "No," Victoria said. "It means we may be looking at the edge of something much larger." She closed the folder and looked at her daughter with an expression that held for just a moment something that went beyond the professional, something that was purely a mother looking at her child and seeing her clearly, completely for who she actually was. "You built this yourself." "You taught me how to read a financial document when I was 15, Emily said. "I did," Victoria said. "I didn't know you remembered." "I remembered everything," Emily said. They went back into the courtroom. The afternoon session began with Caldwell attempting to reframe the hearing around Alexander's contributions to the marital estate, his vision, his leadership, his singular role in building an empire valued at $18 billion. He spoke for 20 minutes, and he was good at it the way a man who has done something for 30 years is good at it, finding the details that build a picture and arranging them with care and practiced skill. Emily watched the judge while Caldwell spoke. She had learned in the years she spent watching Alexander in negotiations that the person whose reaction matters most is usually not the person doing the most talking. The judge was listening, but he was also thinking. She could see it in the way his attention occasionally drifted to the documents on his bench before returning to Caldwell. He was cross-referencing. He was the kind of judge who worked while he listened, and that told her something useful about how he processed information. When it was Victoria's turn, she did not attempt to match Caldwell's narrative sweep. She did something more precise. "Your Honor," she said, "I'd like to talk about Emily Whitmore specifically. Not in general terms, but specifically. Because I think this court deserves to understand exactly who it is we're discussing when we talk about a woman who, according to opposing counsel, contributed nothing of substance to this marriage or to this estate." She opened a folder. In the spring of 2017, Alexander Whitmore's European expansion was on the verge of collapse. 3 of his primary banking partners had withdrawn commitments due to concerns about regulatory exposure in the German market. The deal was worth at that time approximately $2.3 billion. She looked up. It was Emily Whitmore who identified the structural problem in the partnership agreement. It was Emily Whitmore who spent 11 days restructuring the approach, revising the financial model, and presenting a revised proposal to the banking partners. It was Emily Whitmore who flew to Frankfurt without credit, without a title listed on the travel manifest as a spouse, and sat in those meetings and answered every technical question the bank's risk committee had until they were satisfied. The room was quiet. "The deal closed," Victoria said. "Mr. Whitmore's company made $2.3 billion, and Emily flew home and went back to being invisible." Caldwell was on his feet. "Your Honor, these are unsubstantiated claims." "They are substantiated by the emails I am about to enter into evidence," Victoria said. "Internal correspondence from Alexander Whitmore's own executive team referring to, and I'm quoting directly here, Emily's Frankfurt fix. The emails are dated. The authors are identifiable. Several of them are still employed by Mr. Whitmore's companies." She placed the folder on the judge's table. Caldwell sat down. Emily had not known her mother had those emails. She had not known anyone had kept them. The realization moved through her like a current, the understanding that somewhere in the daily record of her invisible work people had noticed. They had written it down. They had not said it to her face perhaps because saying it to her face would have complicated their relationship with her husband, but they had written it down, and the record had survived, and now it was here. She blinked. She would not cry in this courtroom. She had promised herself that weeks ago, and she intended to keep the promise. But the thing she felt in that moment was not grief. It was the very particular and almost unbearable relief of being seen, of being known. The judge reviewed the emails. He reviewed them for a long time. Then he looked at Alexander. "Mr. Whitmore," he said, and his voice had taken on a quality it had not had at the beginning of the day. "Do you dispute that these emails are authentic?" Alexander glanced at Caldwell. "We would need time to verify the documents," Caldwell said. "They came from your client's own server," Victoria said. "Verification should be straightforward." Alexander leaned toward Caldwell and said something that the room could not hear. Caldwell nodded once slowly. "We don't dispute the emails," he said. The judge made a note, and in the gallery one of the reporters had put down their pen and was simply watching. The afternoon moved forward with the relentlessness of something that had been building for a long time and could no longer be slowed. Victoria introduced the pattern Emily had identified in the holding structures carefully, with the precision of someone who understood that complex financial evidence has to be walked into a courtroom like a person being introduced to strangers slowly and with care. She did not overwhelm. She did not perform. She built. And as she built, the room changed. Caldwell's objections became less frequent, and when they came, they were narrower, more technical. The objections of a lawyer trying to limit damage rather than win ground. Alexander's phone was in his hand under the table, and Emily could see from the angle of his wrist that he was typing almost constantly. Reaching out to someone. Reaching out to several someones, probably managing the perception of what was happening in this room before the day ended, and the reporters filed their stories. He had always been good at that, managing perception, controlling the story. But today, the story was not his to control. The session ended at 4:17 in the afternoon, and the judge scheduled the next hearing for 3 weeks later, after the forensic accountant he had appointed had time to begin reviewing the financial records. He ordered both parties to provide complete and unredacted documentation of all assets, domestic and offshore, within the 15-day window he had set. He looked at Alexander when he said unredacted. Alexander looked back at him without expression. When the courtroom cleared, Emily stayed at her table for a moment, after Victoria had begun gathering her documents. She sat with her hands flat on the surface, and she listened to the room emptying around her, the sounds of people collecting their things, conversations beginning in lowered voices, footsteps moving toward the doors. She heard Alexander's voice once on his way out saying something to Caldwell that she couldn't make out. She did not turn to look. She did not need to. She felt the floor under her feet. She was still standing. The evening after the hearing, Emily and Victoria sat together in Emily's small rented apartment, which looked different to Emily than it had that morning, not because anything in it had changed, but because she had. They ate food that Victoria had brought in a bag from a deli 3 blocks away, and they sat at the kitchen table and went through the documents. They still had to prepare for the next session, and they talked, the way they had always talked, best side by side with work in front of them, the conversation woven through the work like thread through fabric. "You were extraordinary today," Emily said at some point in the middle of the evening without looking up from the document she was reviewing. "I was prepared," Victoria said. "There's a difference." "You were both," Emily said. Victoria was quiet for a moment. "I want to tell you something," she said. "Something I have been holding for a long time." Emily looked up. Victoria set down the paper she was holding. She looked at her daughter with the full attention of someone who has something important to say and wants to say it without the buffer of other things between them. "When you called me in March," she said, "and you told me what had been happening, I was not surprised. I want you to know that. Not because I had given up on you or on your marriage, but because I had been watching for years, and I understood more than you knew I understood. And the thing I have never said to you, the thing I kept to myself, because I believed it was something you needed to arrive at yourself, is this." She paused. "You never lost yourself in that marriage, Emily. You kept yourself very carefully. You stored yourself away in a safe place, and you waited, and I believe you waited because some part of you always knew the day would come when you would need everything you had saved." Emily did not respond for a moment. "I was so angry," she said finally. "For years, not at him, at myself, for letting it happen, for not leaving earlier, for not fighting harder." "I know," Victoria said. "I kept thinking if I had just been more done, more spoken louder, he would have seen me differently." "No," Victoria said firmly, and without softness, because her mother had never believed that softening the truth was kindness. "He saw you exactly as you were. He chose not to acknowledge it because acknowledging it would have cost him something he was not willing to pay. That is not your failure. That is his." Emily looked at her mother. "How did you hold all of this for so long?" she said. "How did you watch and not say anything?" Victoria was quiet for a long moment. "Because I trusted you," she said at last. "Because I knew that when you were ready, you would not just walk out of that marriage. You would walk out with everything you needed to rebuild, and I was right." She picked up her document again. "You always were the best student I ever had," she said in a lighter tone, and Emily understood that her mother was stepping back from the depth of what had just been said, because Victoria Harrington felt most comfortable in motion, always moving toward the next right thing, rather than resting in the weight of the moment. Emily understood that too. She picked up her own document. They worked until 11 o'clock, and when Victoria finally closed her briefcase and put on her coat to return to the hotel where she was staying for the duration of the case, Emily walked her to the door, and they stood for a moment in the way they always had, close enough that Emily could smell the particular scent of her mother's coat. The same scent it had always been, old leather and something faintly like cedar. The smell of her childhood, of safety, of someone standing between her and the wind. "Get some sleep," Victoria said. "I will," Emily said. "We have a lot of work left," Victoria said. "I know," Emily said. Victoria looked at her once more, and in that look was everything she had already said and everything she had not said and did not need to. Then she left. Emily closed the door and stood alone in her apartment. She pressed her feet against the floor. She breathed. She thought about Alexander alone in the penthouse they had shared for 8 years, texting people from underneath a conference table, managing the story, trying to contain the damage, doing what he had always done. And she thought about the $430 million that were now the subject of a court-ordered forensic review, and the emails from his own team that said Emily's Frankfurt fix, and the documents she had built herself from the public record of a business she had spent 8 years helping to run without credit or recognition, or even the basic courtesy of being acknowledged in the room where her work was being praised. She thought about all of it, and then she opened her laptop and went back to work. Because Alexander Whitmore had built his empire on the assumption that the people around him were too dependent on him to resist him. And Emily had spent the last 6 months quietly, methodically, and completely disproving that assumption. She had not finished yet. She was just getting started. And the next hearing was 3 weeks away. The 3 weeks between hearings were the longest of Alexander Whitmore's professional life. He did not sleep well. His assistant noticed. His housekeeper noticed. Even the doorman at his building, a man named Gerald, who had worked the lobby for 11 years and who Alexander had never once asked about his family, noticed that the man who came through those doors every morning had changed in some quality that was hard to name but impossible to miss. Something had gone out of him, some foundational certainty. Alexander did not acknowledge this to anyone. He was not a man who acknowledged weakness, not to his attorneys, not to his business partners, and certainly not to the people who worked around the edges of his life. What he did instead was what he had always done when something threatened him. He moved faster, pushed harder, and called in every favor he had accumulated over 20 years of building an empire. He called 3 federal contacts he had never needed before. He hired a private investigator to look into Victoria Harrington's legal activities over the past decade, looking for anything that could be used to challenge her standing. He had 2 of his senior executives reach out quietly to former colleagues of Victoria's at the Bar Association, asking questions that were carefully framed as routine inquiry and were nothing of the kind. None of it produced what he needed. Victoria Harrington was, as it turned out, exactly what she appeared to be, a woman with an impeccable record, a current license, and 30 years of wins that had never been successfully challenged on appeal. The private investigator reported back within a week. His summary was brief. "There's nothing there," he said. "She's clean." Alexander told him to look harder. The investigator came back 5 days later with the same answer. Meanwhile, the forensic accountant the judge had appointed was working through the financial records with the unhurried thoroughness of someone who understood that the quality of the work mattered more than the speed of it. His name was Daniel Park, and he had spent 18 years doing exactly this kind of work, untangling the financial architectures of people who had built things specifically designed to be untangled only with great difficulty, and he was very good at it. Emily knew he was good at it because she had researched him the moment the judge named him. She had read his published work, reviewed the cases he had testified in, and spent an afternoon reading a lengthy interview he had given to a financial publication 3 years earlier, in which he described his methodology with a clarity and precision that told her everything she needed to know about how he approached his work. He would find what was there to be found. She was certain of that. What she was less certain about was whether what he found would be enough. Because the thing about financial concealment at the level Alexander operated was that it was rarely clean. It was rarely a single account hidden in a single jurisdiction. It was layered structures built inside structures, each one designed to make the next one harder to see. And Daniel Park, good as he was, had only been given 15 days and access to what the court had ordered Alexander to disclose. Emily had given this problem a great deal of thought. She had also quietly and without telling anyone, except her mother, done something about it. 3 days after the first hearing, she had made a phone call to a man named Thomas Garrett, who had worked for 7 years as the chief financial officer of one of Alexander's subsidiary companies before leaving abruptly 18 months ago under circumstances that had never been publicly explained. Emily had met Thomas twice at company events. She remembered him as a precise, serious man who chose his words carefully and who had looked on both occasions like someone carrying something heavier than his job description. She had found his number through a former colleague of her own from her pre-marriage career, and she had called him on a Wednesday evening and spoken to him for 4 minutes carefully and without pressure. And at the end of those 4 minutes, he had said, "I'll call you back." He called back the next morning. What Thomas Garrett told her over the following 2 weeks in 3 separate conversations that Emily recorded with his knowledge and consent was not a story Emily had not suspected. It was a story she had suspected, and now had confirmed in specific detail by a man who had been inside the architecture she had been mapping from the outside. The offshore transfers Victoria had introduced in the first hearing were not, as Caldwell had argued, routine corporate restructuring. They were the latest iteration of a pattern that had been running for at least 6 years. Thomas had become aware of it approximately 2 years into his tenure as CFO when he noticed discrepancies between the internal accounts he managed and the consolidated reports being submitted to the holding company's board. He had raised it internally. He had been told it was a rounding issue. He had raised it again 3 months later with documentation. He had been told his contract would not be renewed. He left. He said nothing publicly. He had signed a non-disclosure agreement with enough legal weight behind it that he had spent the 18 months since his departure consulting a personal attorney about whether he was able to say anything at all without consequences. What Emily had told him carefully, and having done her research on this specific question before making the call, was that an NDA cannot be used to prevent a witness from cooperating with a court-ordered financial review. It can prohibit many things. It cannot prohibit that. His attorney had confirmed it within 24 hours. Thomas had called Emily back and said, "Tell me what you need." She had told him. And then she had told Victoria. Victoria had listened to the recordings, read the summary Emily had prepared, and been quiet for a long time. "You understand what this means," she said finally. "Yes," Emily said. "This changes the shape of the case." "I know." "It also changes the risk," Victoria said. "Alexander will know you found him. He will know someone talked. He will do everything in his power to discredit it before it reaches the court." "Then we need to get it to the court before he knows it's coming," Emily said. Victoria looked at her daughter for a moment. "When did you become so tactical?" she said. Emily thought about that. "I learned from watching someone who was," she said. "He just didn't know he was teaching me." The second hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in January, and Emily arrived 20 minutes early. Victoria was already at the table when she came in, her briefcase open, organized with the efficiency of a woman who had done this so many times that preparation was less a process than a reflex. Alexander arrived at 8:58 with Caldwell and 2 of the other attorneys from the first hearing, plus a new face. Emily didn't recognize a younger man who moved with the focused urgency of someone who had been brought in for a specific purpose. She filed that information away without reacting to it. Alexander looked at Emily when he came through the door. It was the first time she had seen him since the first hearing, and the look he gave her was different from anything he had shown her in the courtroom 3 weeks earlier. It was not contemptuous. It was not amused. It was something she had never seen on his face in 10 years of marriage. It was measuring. He was trying to understand what she knew. She held his gaze for exactly 2 seconds and then looked back at the document in front of her. The judge entered at 9 o'clock and the room stood and settled, and the second hearing began. Daniel Park took the stand first. He was a compact man in his early 50s with an unhurried manner that suggested he had testified many times before and found the experience neither intimidating nor particularly interesting. He answered the judge's preliminary questions about his credentials and methodology with the practiced brevity of someone who knows what the court needs and provides exactly that, nothing more. Then Victoria began her examination. "Mr. Park," she said, "you have had 3 weeks to review the financial records in this case. Can you describe in general terms what you found?" "I can," he said. "I found evidence of systematic and deliberate asset movement designed to reduce the apparent value of the marital estate." Caldwell was on his feet immediately. "Objection, Your Honor. The witness is characterizing intent without basis." "The basis is the documents," Park said calmly before the judge could rule. "Specifically the timing of the transfers, the structure of the receiving entities, and the pattern of activity across a minimum 6-year period. Intent is not something I'm guessing at. It's something the documentary record describes." The judge looked at Caldwell. "Overruled. Continue." Victoria walked Park through the framework of what he had found methodically building from the broadest outlines inward. The offshore structures, the timing of transfers relative to the divorce filing, the shell companies in 3 jurisdictions whose ultimate beneficial ownership traced back through a chain that required careful and patient documentation to follow to Alexander Whitmore. As Park spoke, Emily watched Alexander. He was listening with the particular stillness she had identified at the first hearing, the stillness of a man working hard to appear unaffected. His pen moved on the legal pad in front of him, occasionally notes she could not read from her angle, but the movements were controlled, deliberate, the movements of a man who was deciding what to reveal to his own attorneys about what they were hearing. That told her something important. Even Caldwell didn't know everything. The twist came 40 minutes into Park's testimony, and it came from a direction Emily had not expected, which was the best possible kind. Park was describing the Gibraltar entity, one of 3 offshore structures he had identified as central to the transfer pattern when he paused. He looked at his documents, then he looked at the judge. "Your Honor," he said, "in the course of my review, I identified a related set of transactions that fall outside the scope of what I was originally asked to examine. I want to flag them for the court because I believe they are material." The judge leaned forward. "Go ahead." "Within the Gibraltar structure," Park said, "I found evidence of payments made to a series of consulting entities over a period of 4 years. The payments total approximately $22 million. The consulting entities do not appear to have provided any actual consulting services. In 2 cases, I was unable to identify any business activity by those entities whatsoever beyond receiving these payments." He looked up from his documents. "This is a pattern consistent with what is typically described as a fraudulent payment scheme. I want to be careful about terminology here because it is not my role to make legal characterizations. But I am obligated to report what the documents show, and what they show is this money moved from Alexander Whitmore's corporate structures to entities that appear to exist primarily to receive it." The courtroom was completely silent. Victoria let the silence hold for 3 full seconds before she spoke. "Mr. Park," she said, "in your professional experience, what type of arrangement typically produces this pattern?" "Typically," Park said, "it is used to move money off the books in a way that makes it difficult to trace, sometimes for tax purposes, sometimes for other purposes. The common element is concealment." Caldwell was on his feet, but he was slower this time, as though the weight of what was happening had begun to affect even his physical responses. "Your Honor, this testimony goes far beyond the scope of the court-ordered review, and we strongly object to its inclusion in these proceedings." "The court-ordered review included all financial records provided by Mr. Whitmore," Victoria said. "These transactions are in those records. Mr. Park did not go looking for them. He found them in the course of doing exactly what this court asked him to do. The judge looked at Park. Mr. Park, are these transactions contained within the documents Mr. Whitmore provided pursuant to the court order? They are, Park said. Then they are within the scope of the review, the judge said. Objection overruled. He made a long note. Then he looked at Alexander over the top of the bench with an expression that had moved over the course of the morning from carefully neutral to something considerably less comfortable. Mr. Caldwell, the judge said, I want to be direct with both parties this morning. The picture being developed in this testimony raises questions that go beyond the dissolution of this marriage. I am going to be making a referral to the appropriate regulatory authorities for independent review of what has been presented today. That process is separate from and will not delay these proceedings. Alexander stood up. It was the first time he had spoken directly in the hearing since the judge had shut him down in the first session for speaking without recognition, and the fact that he stood now without waiting, without instruction from Caldwell, told Emily that something had broken through the control he had been exercising all morning. Your Honor, he said, and his voice was different, the authority still there but strained now like a structure under load. I want to be clear. Whatever Mr. Park has found is the result of standard corporate practice complex, yes, but entirely legal. My attorneys will demonstrate that in detail. I am not going to sit here and allow my reputation and my business to be destroyed by a politically motivated financial review. The judge looked at him. Mr. Whitmore, he said, you will address the court through your counsel, or you will not address it at all. Is that understood? A beat. Yes, Your Honor, Alexander said. He sat down. Caldwell put a hand on his arm. Alexander moved his arm away. Victoria was watching this exchange with the stillness of a woman who has seen many moments like this one and knows exactly what they mean. When the judge returned his attention to the room, she spoke. Your Honor, with the court's permission, I'd like to introduce additional testimony from a witness whose account speaks directly to the pattern Mr. Park has identified. Caldwell was immediately alert. Who is this witness? We have received no notification of additional witnesses. The witness was identified subsequent to the close of the discovery period as a result of information that came to light during the forensic review, Victoria said. His testimony is directly responsive to what Mr. Park has just described. We submit that the court has both the authority and the obligation to hear it. The judge considered this for a long moment. I'll allow it, he said. Mr. Caldwell, you will have the opportunity for cross-examination. Victoria turned toward the back of the courtroom. The defense calls Thomas Garrett. The sound Alexander made when he heard that name was not loud. It was barely audible. But Emily heard it because she was close enough and because she had spent 10 years learning to hear the things Alexander tried not to show. And what she heard in that sound was not anger. It was recognition. The recognition of a man who has just understood how he lost. Thomas Garrett walked the length of the courtroom with the careful posture of someone who has made a decision they are not entirely comfortable with and has decided to keep making it anyway. He was dressed conservatively, a dark suit, no tie, and he took the stand and was sworn in and looked straight ahead while he did it. Not at Alexander, not at Emily, at the space in front of him. The way a person looks when they are focusing on the next sentence rather than the whole of what they are about to say. Victoria began quietly. Mr. Garrett, how long did you work for Alexander Whitmore's companies? 7 years, he said, from 2015 to 2022. What was your role? Chief Financial Officer of Whitmore Capital Partners, one of the primary subsidiary holding companies. And in that capacity, were you aware of the payment structures that Mr. Park has described this morning? Thomas Garrett took a breath. Yes, he said. I became aware of them in 2017. The room held. Can you describe what you observed? And Thomas Garrett described it. He described it with the specificity of a man who had spent 7 years working inside a financial structure. He understood completely who had kept his silence for 18 months under the weight of an NDA he had believed was absolute, and who was now on a Tuesday morning in January saying out loud the things he had told himself he would never be able to say. He described the payments. He described the consultants that were not consultants. He described the moment he had raised it internally and what had been said to him, and he described the morning he had cleared his desk and left a building he had worked in for 7 years without saying goodbye to anyone, because he was afraid that if he stayed another hour, he would be unable to leave without consequences he wasn't prepared for. When he was finished, the room did not erupt. It settled. the way things settle after something heavy has been set down. Caldwell's cross-examination lasted 40 minutes. He went after Thomas Garrett's NDA, his motivations, his departure, the gaps in his direct knowledge, the distinction between what he had observed and what he could prove. Thomas answered every question with the same careful specificity he had brought to his direct testimony. Not defensive, not combative, simply precise and precision was what made him impossible to meaningfully undermine. Emily watched Alexander during the cross-examination. He had gone very still again, the deep stillness she now associated with him at his most frightened. His pen was not moving. His phone was face down. He was staring at a fixed point somewhere above the witness stand. I was doing what she had watched him do in difficult business meetings over 10 years. He was recalculating, running numbers, looking for an exit. She knew that look. She also knew this time that the calculation was not going to come out the way he needed it to. The cross-examination ended. Thomas stepped down. He walked back through the courtroom without looking at Alexander, and Emily watched him go and felt something she had not expected, gratitude so complete it was almost physical. This man had carried something for 18 months that did not belong to him. He had carried it because he was afraid, and then he had put it down because Emily had called him on a Wednesday evening and told him he was allowed to. And the world had not ended when he did. That was worth something. The judge called a recess at 12:40, and the room shifted and breathed, and people stood and moved toward the doors. Alexander's legal team clustered immediately at their table in the intense, low-voiced conference of people doing damage assessment. Emily watched them from across the room, while Victoria gathered her documents beside her. Thomas was extraordinary, Emily said. How was honest, Victoria said. In a room full of strategy, honesty is always extraordinary. Emily considered that. What happens now? She said. Now, Victoria said, not looking up from her folder. Alexander has to make a decision. He can continue to fight, in which case everything Park found and everything Thomas described becomes part of the public record in increasing detail. Or he can look at what has been built in this courtroom over 2 hearings and calculate whether the cost of continuing outweighs the cost of settling. Which do you think he'll choose? Victoria closed her folder. He'll fight, she said. Men like Alexander always fight 1 round longer than they should. It's the thing that built him, and it's the thing that will cost him the most. She looked at Emily. But the outcome will be the same either way. She said it without triumph. She said it the way she said everything as a fact, plainly because it was true. Emily believed her. She had believed her mother about very few things, less than completely her entire life. And standing in that courtroom, with the weight of the morning sitting in the room around her, with Thomas Garrett's words still in the air, and Daniel Park's testimony documented in the official record, and $430 million, subject to a court-ordered review, she believed her now. The fight was not over, but the shape of it had changed completely. When the recess ended and the afternoon session began, Caldwell made his counter-argument with everything he had. He challenged Park's methodology. He questioned Thomas Garrett's credibility. He presented Alexander as a visionary businessman whose complex corporate structures were the normal and necessary architecture of a company operating at a global level, mischaracterized by a forensic accountant working under time pressure and a disgruntled former employee with a grievance. How was good? He was genuinely professionally good, the way a person is when they have been doing something at the highest level for 30 years. But the documents were already in the record, and the judge had already made his note. When the afternoon ended and the session closed, the judge set the final hearing for 6 weeks out and said in language that left very little room for interpretation that he expected both parties to use that time productively. He looked at Alexander when he said it. And Alexander, who had walked into the first hearing 3 weeks ago with the confidence of a man who had already decided how things ended, walked out of the second one without saying a word to anyone, not to Caldwell, not to his other attorneys, not to the associates who hovered at a careful distance behind him. He walked to the elevator, pressed the button, and stood with his back to the room while he waited. Emily watched him from across the lobby. She thought about the man she had married, the one who had told her on their second date that he had never met anyone like her. She thought about whether that man had ever really existed, or whether he had been from the beginning a version Alexander had constructed for a purpose and then discarded when the purpose was served. She thought she would probably never know the answer to that. She was not sure it mattered anymore. What mattered was what was in the record. What mattered was what came next. What mattered was that she had built something true out of years she had spent being invisible, and the court had seen it, and the record held it, and no amount of recalculating or managing or calling in favors was going to change what was written in those pages. The elevator opened. Alexander stepped inside. The doors closed. Emily turned back toward her mother. "Let's go to work," she said. Victoria picked up her briefcase. "We never stopped," she said, and they walked out of the courthouse together into the cold January afternoon, two women with work to do and 6 weeks to do it in, and the most important part of this story still ahead of them. The 6 weeks between the second hearing and the final one were not quiet. They were not in any sense the kind of weeks where two sides of a legal dispute retreat to their corners and wait. They were 6 weeks of continuous movement pressure applied and redirected documents filed and answered motions submitted and argued in writing. And underneath all of that official procedural activity, a quieter and more consequential kind of work happening in the spaces between. Alexander moved first 3 days after the second hearing. He instructed Caldwell to file a motion challenging Thomas Garrett's testimony on the grounds that his departure from Whitmore Capital Partners constituted a breach of his NDA, that any information he had shared with opposing counsel was therefore privileged and protected, and that his testimony should be struck from the record pending a separate civil action Alexander intended to bring against him personally. Victoria had anticipated this. She had prepared the response before the motion was filed because she knew Alexander well enough by now, through Emily's descriptions and through her own observation of him across 2 hearings, to understand how he would react to something that threatened him. He would attack the source. He would try to make the problem about the person who named it rather than about the thing being named. It was a tactic that had worked for him many times over the years, and it was a tactic Victoria had spent 40 years watching fail in courtrooms when the underlying evidence was strong enough. The underlying evidence was strong enough. The judge denied the motion in 4 days, which was fast, and the speed of the denial told both legal teams something about how the court viewed the pattern of Alexander's procedural responses. Caldwell called Victoria the morning after the denial. Emily was at the apartment when the call came through, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and a set of documents, and she watched her mother take the call and stand at the window and listen for a long time before she spoke. "I appreciate the call, Richard," Victoria said at last. "But we're not at that number, not close." She listened again. "I understand your client's position," she said. "But the position has changed significantly since the second hearing, and I think you know that." Another pause. "Tell him to think carefully," Victoria said. "He has 2 weeks before we go back in front of that judge. What we present in that final hearing will be in the public record permanently. That's a choice he still has right now, but it closes the moment we walk through those doors." She ended the call and looked at Emily. "He offered settlement," Emily said. It was not a question. "He offered a number," Victoria said. "Not a settlement. A number designed to make this go away without acknowledging anything that's been established in the record." "How far off is it?" "Far enough that I'm not going to repeat it to you," Victoria said, "because I don't want you to spend energy on a figure that isn't serious." Emily nodded. She picked up her coffee. She thought for a moment about the version of herself who had received Alexander's first settlement offer 6 months ago. The number that had been designed to humiliate, that had been so far below what she had contributed to their life together, that she had sat with it for an evening and felt not anger, but a particular bone-deep sadness, the sadness of finally understanding how little she had been valued by someone she had loved completely. That version of herself felt very far away now. "Then we prepare for the final hearing," Emily said. "Yes," Victoria said, "and there is something I want to show you." She placed a small audio recorder on the table between them. Emily looked at it. "What is that?" she said. "Something Thomas Garrett gave me," Victoria said, "when we met last week to prepare his follow-up documentation. He mentioned it at the end of our conversation almost in passing. I don't think he fully understood what he had." She pressed play. The audio was not perfect. There was background noise, the ambient sound of an office air conditioning, the muffled sounds of a building at work. But the voices were clear enough. One of them was Thomas Garrett, and the other one was Alexander Whitmore. The recording was 18 months old. Thomas had made it on the day he understood his contract would not be renewed when he had been called into a meeting with Alexander to discuss his departure. He had recorded it, he told Victoria, not because he had planned to use it, but because he was afraid, and he wanted to remember exactly what was said. He had carried it for 18 months. He had told no one about it. On the recording. Alexander's voice was recognizable and completely at ease. The voice of a man in his own territory, managing a situation he had managed many times before. "You're good at your job, Thomas," Alexander said on the tape. "That's the problem." Thomas's voice quieter, more careful. "I don't understand what you mean." "You understand exactly what I mean," Alexander said. "You found something you weren't supposed to find. That happens. The question is, what a smart man does when it happens. I raised it internally. I followed the correct process." "There is no correct process for this," Alexander said. "There is the process that exists and the process that actually governs how things work here, and you've been here long enough to know the difference. I like you. I don't want this to become complicated." A pause. Then Alexander's voice again lower with an edge in it that the recording caught clearly despite the background noise. "Emily won't understand the business. She never has. She doesn't need to. She'll leave with whatever I decide to give her, and all of this stays exactly where it is. That's how this works. Do you understand me?" The recording ended. Emily sat very still. She had heard her own name on a tape made 18 months ago, in a conversation she had not been part of, in a room she had never been in, and the thing Alexander had said about her landed in her chest with the specific weight of a truth she had known for years without being able to prove. He had never intended to give her anything. Not at the end. Not if he could help it. She had been a variable in his calculation from the beginning, and the calculation had always been designed to produce the same result. Alexander keeps everything. Emily gets what Alexander decides she deserves, and the architecture he had built over 20 years remains exactly where it is. "Are you all right?" Victoria said. Emily looked at the recorder on the table. "He said it like it was nothing," she said. "Like I was nothing." "Yes," Victoria said. "He said it to a man he was trying to intimidate out of the building," Emily said. "It wasn't even about me. I was just an example he used, to explain how things work." "Yes," Victoria said again. She did not soften it because Emily did not need softening. She needed the truth said plainly the way her mother had always told the truth, because plain truth, however hard, was the only kind that held up when you needed to stand on it. Emily sat with it for a moment. Then she said, "We're using it." "I know," Victoria said. "I've already confirmed with Thomas. He consents to its use. The recording is legally obtained under New York law. One-party consent state. Everything Thomas did is clean." Emily looked at her mother. "How long have you been sitting on this?" she said. 4 days, Victoria said. "I wanted to be certain of its admissibility before I told you." "You were protecting me," Emily said. "I was being a lawyer," Victoria said, and then after a pause, "And yes, I was protecting you. It is possible to do both." The final hearing began on a Thursday morning in late February, and it was a different room from the one that had assembled for the first hearing 2 months earlier. The gallery was fuller. There were more reporters. There were people Emily recognized from Alexander's professional world who had not been at the earlier hearings, people who had waited to see which way the current ran before showing up, and who had now apparently made their calculation. They were watching from the gallery. The judge entered and the room settled and the final hearing began. Caldwell went first. He had restructured his case significantly since the second hearing, abandoning several of the arguments he had led with in the first session and building instead around a framework that accepted implicitly the reality that the forensic review had established, while arguing that the assets in question had been mischaracterized, that the transfers were legal, and that the marriage's equitable distribution had to account for Alexander's singular and irreplaceable role in generating the wealth that existed. He was doing what Victoria had predicted he would do. He was narrowing his perimeter, protecting what he could protect, and hoping the judge's resolution would land inside the smaller circle he was drawing. Victoria let him finish. She had a quality in the courtroom that Emily had come to understand over the course of the 3 hearings she never hurried. She moved at a pace that was entirely her own, and the pace was always slightly slower than the room expected. And that slight slowness was itself a form of authority, because it communicated without words that she was not responding to pressure. She was proceeding on her own terms. When Caldwell finished, Victoria stood. She introduced 3 new financial documents, first detailed analyses, prepared in response to Caldwell's most recent filings documents that addressed his narrowed argument directly and established with specificity that the transfers at the center of the case could not be characterized as routine corporate activity, regardless of how they were framed, because the pattern of timing and structure told a story that the characterization could not accommodate. The judge reviewed them. He asked 3 questions. Victoria answered each one without consulting any document from memory, which told the room something about how thoroughly she knew this material. Then she said, "Your Honor, I'd like to introduce audio evidence." Caldwell was immediately on his feet. "We have received no notification of audio evidence. It was disclosed to you and to the court in our filings submitted Tuesday morning," Victoria said. 17 pages exhibit list includes audio recording, Garrett recording dated October 14, 2022. Caldwell looked at his younger colleague, the one Emily had noticed at the second hearing. The younger man was flipping through a folder with the rapid, slightly panicked movements of someone who has realized they missed something important. He found the page, read it, and leaned toward Caldwell with an expression that answered whatever question Caldwell had been about to ask. Caldwell sat down. "The filing is confirmed," he said. He said it flatly. "Your Honor," Victoria said, "I'd like to play the recording for the court." The judge nodded. The audio played through the courtroom's speaker system, and the quality, which had seemed adequate on the small recorder in Emily's kitchen, was somehow more devastating at volume in a room full of people with nothing else to listen to. Alexander's voice filled the space with the ease of a man completely at home in his own authority, managing a situation he believed he controlled, and every word he said landed in that room with the finality of something that cannot be unsaid. When the recording reached the line about Emily, "She'll leave with whatever I decide to give her," there was a sound from the gallery that was not a gasp exactly, but was the collective involuntary intake of breath that happens when a room full of people hears something that confirms what they suspected but hoped was not true. Emily sat absolutely still. She did not look at Alexander. She had heard the recording 4 times already. She had prepared herself for this moment. But preparation and presence are different things, and sitting in a room full of strangers, while her name was spoken in the voice of the man she had loved for 10 years, in a recording made behind her back, 18 months ago, was a different experience from anything she had rehearsed. She pressed her feet against the floor and breathed. When the recording ended, the silence was complete and lasted for a long moment. Then Alexander did something that no one in the room expected. He stood up, not to address the court. He didn't speak. He simply stood, and the act of standing had about it the quality of a reflex, the involuntary response of a man whose body has decided to move before his mind has decided what to do. Caldwell put a hand on his arm and said something in a voice too low for the room to hear, and Alexander looked at him for a moment and then sat back down. But the moment was visible to everyone. The judge looked at Alexander for a long count of 3. Then he looked at Victoria. "Counsel," he said, "you may continue." What followed was 90 minutes of structured, methodical argument that Victoria delivered with the precision of someone who had been building toward this moment for months. She addressed the equitable distribution framework. She addressed Emily's documented contributions to the marital estate, the Frankfurt deal, the board work, the 8 years of financial analysis and strategic support that had been performed without title compensation or credit. She addressed the offshore transfers. She addressed Daniel Park's forensic findings. She addressed the recording. And then she introduced the last document. It was a valuation, prepared by an independent financial expert who had spent 6 weeks analyzing the specific contributions Emily Whitmore had made to the growth of Alexander's business holdings during their marriage, calculating conservatively and with documented methodology the dollar value of the work she had done. The number was significant. Caldwell objected to the valuation methodology. The judge overruled him and said he would take the document into consideration. Then the judge looked at both parties. "Before I hear closing statements," he said, "I want to address something directly." He looked at Alexander. "Mr. Whitmore, in 31 years on this bench, I have heard many divorce cases involving significant assets. I have heard arguments about contribution and valuation and equitable distribution in every configuration you can imagine. What I have heard in this courtroom over the past 2 months is something I want the record to reflect clearly." He picked up one of the documents before him. "This court has received forensic evidence of systematic asset concealment. This court has received testimony from a credible witness with direct knowledge of the financial structures at issue. And this court has now heard an audio recording in which you, Mr. Whitmore, stated explicitly that your wife would receive whatever you decided to give her. He set the document down. That is not how equitable distribution works in the state of New York. That is not how this court works. And I want to make certain that is understood before we proceed. Alexander's jaw was tight. His hands were flat on the table. Yes, Your Honor, Caldwell said for him. The closing statements took an hour. Caldwell argued ably for a narrowed interpretation of the estate leaning on Alexander's contributions and the legal complexity of the corporate structures. Victoria argued for a comprehensive reckoning that accounted for everything the record had established, not as punishment, but as accuracy, as the court's obligation to reflect what was actually true about who had built what and at what cost. When she finished, the room was quiet again. The judge looked at his documents. He made several notes. He looked up. I'll deliver my ruling in 7 days, he said. I want the record to reflect that this court will be forwarding the forensic financial report to the appropriate regulatory authorities for independent review. That action is outside the scope of this proceeding, but it is required by law, given what has been presented here. He looked at Alexander one final time. Court is adjourned. The room stood. The noise of movement and release filled the space as people gathered themselves and began to talk, and in the middle of all of it, Alexander Whitmore sat at his table for a moment before rising, and in that moment before Caldwell spoke to him and the professional machinery reassembled around him. Emily looked at him across the room and saw something she had not expected to see. He looked tired, not defeated exactly, not yet that would come with the ruling, but tired in the deep way of someone who has been holding something heavy for a very long time and has just begun to understand that he will not be able to hold it much longer. She looked at him for exactly as long as it took her to understand what she was seeing. Then she looked away. Across the room, a woman from the gallery was making her way toward the exit, and as she passed the reporter who had been there at every hearing, they exchanged a look that said, without words, that the story they had been watching had become something larger than either of them had anticipated when it began. Victoria was beside Emily. 7 days, Emily said. 7 days, Victoria confirmed. Emily picked up her bag. She thought about what she had to do in the next 7 days, the preparation for whatever the ruling contained, the conversations she would need to have, the steps she was already planning beyond the outcome of this case, the things she was building that had nothing to do with Alexander and everything to do with who she was becoming. I want to tell you something, she said to her mother, and she said it quietly, not because it was a private thing, but because it was a true thing, and true things she had learned do not need volume. Victoria looked at her. I'm not afraid of the ruling, Emily said. Whatever it is, I'm not afraid of it, and I don't think I've said anything like that in this entire process without having to work to mean it. But right now, I mean it without working at all. Victoria studied her for a moment. When did that happen? She said. Emily thought about it. Somewhere between the first hearing and today, she said. I'm not sure exactly when, but it happened. Victoria nodded slowly. That, she said, is worth more than any ruling. They walked out of the courthouse together, and the February air was cold and direct in the way that late winter air in New York always is without apology, and Emily pulled her coat tighter and walked beside her mother and thought about 7 days and about what came after 7 days and about all the things she had saved in herself during 10 years of marriage that she had not lost, that she had stored carefully as her mother had told her, and that she was now steadily and without hurry beginning to spend on herself. She was 43 years old. She had a great deal of time left, and she intended to use every day of it on her own terms. 2 days after the hearing, Caldwell called Victoria again. This time the number was different. Victoria wrote it on a notepad, looked at it for a moment, and called Emily. He moved, she said. Emily was quiet on the other end for a moment. How far, she said. Victoria told her the number. Emily was quiet again, longer this time. It's closer, she said. It's still not right. No, Victoria said. It's not right. Then we wait for the ruling, Emily said. Yes, Victoria said. He knows what's coming, Emily said. That's why he moved. He's trying to settle before the ruling makes it worse. Yes, Victoria said. Let him wait, Emily said. And they waited. 5 days later, Caldwell called a third time. The The number had moved again. It had moved to a place that was for the first time in the entire process within the range that Victoria had identified at the beginning as the outer boundary of what a reasonable ruling might produce. Victoria did not accept it. She said she would discuss it with her client. She said she needed 24 hours. She did not need 24 hours. She needed 40 minutes, most of which she spent on the phone with Emily going through the terms line by line, not just the number but the structure of it, the acknowledgments, the provisions, the language that would govern what Alexander could and could not say publicly about the marriage and its end. There was one term Emily added herself. It was not a financial term. It was a single paragraph drafted by Victoria on Emily's instruction requiring that any public statement made by Alexander Whitmore or his representatives about the dissolution of the marriage acknowledge Emily's contributions to the business she had spent 8 years helping to build. Not in detail, not extensively, just acknowledged, just true. Caldwell called it unprecedented. Victoria said they could proceed to the ruling if he preferred. The paragraph remained in the agreement. The settlement was signed on a Friday morning 4 days before the judge's ruling was due, in a room that contained both legal teams and no one else. Alexander was not present. He signed his copies the night before and had them couriered to Caldwell's office. Emily signed at the table with her mother beside her, and when she placed her pen against the last signature line and paused for just a moment before signing, it was not hesitation. It was the opposite of hesitation. It was the recognition of a moment, the simple, deliberate act of knowing that what she was about to do would change the shape of everything that came after. She signed. Victoria countersigned as her counsel. The room was quiet, and then it was done. Not everything Alexander had taken from her came back in that settlement. Some things, the years, the invisibility, the mornings she had spent managing someone else's ambition, while her own waited in a drawer she kept locked out of habit and then out of something closer to surrender. Those things did not come back because they could not. But the financial reality of what she had contributed was acknowledged and compensated formally legally in language that would outlast every conversation that had ever been had about who Emily Whitmore was and what she had been worth. The acknowledgement paragraph was in there. It was real. It was on paper. It was hers. Outside the building, the February sky had shifted towards something that might later in the day become the first tentative warmth of late winter. Emily stood on the sidewalk with her coat open and her hands free and thought about a morning 10 years ago when she had flown to Frankfurt and sat in a conference room and answered every question the bank's risk committee had until they were satisfied, and how she had flown home and gone back to being invisible, and how that morning had never been counted, never acknowledged had existed, only in an email chain that said Emily's Frankfurt fix, and that she had not known about until her mother showed it to her in a courtroom in December. She thought about it, and then she let it go. Not because it didn't matter, because it was already in the record, because it had already been seen, and because the thing that was in front of her now was not the past. It was what came after the past, and what came after was entirely, and for the first time in a very long time, entirely hers to decide. She pulled out her phone. She had a call to make. Not to her attorney, not to anyone connected to the case that had just ended. She had a call to make to a woman she had been speaking with for 6 weeks, a woman who ran a financial literacy organization for women coming out of controlling relationships, a woman who had reached out to Emily after the first hearing because a mutual contact had mentioned what she was going through, and who had said in their first conversation, "When this is over, I want to talk to you about what you're going to do next." Emily had told her she would call when it was over. It was over. She made the call. The call Emily made standing on that February sidewalk lasted 22 minutes. The woman on the other end was named Carol Simmons, and she ran an organization called Second Floor, a financial literacy and legal resource center for women emerging from controlling relationships, operating out of offices in 3 cities, with a staff of 14 and a waiting list that had grown by 40% in the past year alone. Carol had built it herself over 11 years, starting with a single room, a donated laptop, and the specific determination of someone who had been in a situation she did not intend to stay in, and who had decided on her way out to leave a door open for the women who came after her. Emily had known from their first conversation 6 weeks earlier that this was a woman she needed to know. Carol had answered on the second ring, and when Emily said, "It's done," there was a pause, and then Carol said quietly and without celebration, "Good. Now tell me what you want to build." That was the question Emily had been sitting with for 6 weeks. Not as an abstract aspiration, but as a practical problem she had been working on with the same focused attention she had brought to building the financial case against Alexander. She had been reading. She had been talking to people. She had been mapping in the private notebooks she kept at the kitchen table in the rental apartment the shape of what she understood and the shape of what was needed, and the gap between those two things that a person with her specific combination of skills and resources and hard-won knowledge might be able to help close. She had not built a foundation yet. She had not written a charter or incorporated anything or made any of the official structural moves that convert an intention into an institution. She had done what she always did when she was working at her best. She had started by understanding the problem completely before she decided what to do about it. "I want to build something that addresses the financial architecture of these situations," Emily said to Carol. "Not just the legal resources, not just the emotional support, which matters enormously and which you do extraordinarily well. I want to address the specific financial mechanisms that men like Alexander use to make women feel like they have nothing when they actually have a great deal. The hidden accounts, the asset structures, the way money is used as a control mechanism before anyone ever sets foot in a courtroom." She paused. "I want women to understand what they actually have before they reach the crisis point, before the accounts are frozen, before the lawyers are hired, before they're standing in a rental apartment with 6 weeks to build a case." Carol was quiet for a moment. "That's a gap," she said. "A real one." "I know it's a gap," Emily said. "I lived in it for 6 weeks." "More than 6 weeks," Carol said gently. Emily thought about that. "Yes," she said, "more than 6 weeks." They talked for another quarter hour about structure and scope and timeline and the practical questions of what it would take to move from idea to action. When the call ended, Emily stood on the sidewalk for another moment and looked up at the February sky and felt something she had not felt in what seemed like a very long time: impatience. The good kind. The kind that comes not from anxiety, but from readiness, from having somewhere to be and knowing it and wanting to get there. She had somewhere to be. She started moving. The first board meeting of what would become the Harrington Whitmore Foundation, the name Emily chose deliberately honoring both the woman who had raised her and the marriage that had taught her, took place 8 weeks after the settlement was signed in a conference room in Midtown that Carol had loaned them for the afternoon. The 5 people around the table had been chosen by Emily over the preceding weeks with the care she brought to everything, not for their prominence, though several of them were prominent, but for the specific things they understood that she needed around her. Thomas Garrett was one of them. He had not expected the invitation. When Emily called him to ask, he had been quiet for long enough that she thought the connection had dropped. "You want me on your board," he said finally. "I want someone who understands how these financial structures work from the inside," Emily said. "Someone who has seen the mechanisms that make women vulnerable to exactly this kind of situation, and who has the specific expertise to help us educate women about what to look for before they need a forensic accountant to untangle it for them." Another pause. "I testified against your husband," he said. "Against your ex-husband. Some people would consider that a complicated foundation for a professional relationship. I consider it a qualification," Emily said. He said yes. Carol Simmons was another board member bringing the operational knowledge of 11 years running Second Floor and a network of relationships in the legal aid and women's services community that Emily would have taken years to build on her own. The third was a woman named Dr. Patricia Okafor, a financial psychologist who had published extensively on the intersection of money power and intimate relationships, whose research Emily had been reading for weeks, and whose work had given her a framework for understanding things she had experienced without having had language for. The fourth was a man named James Whitfield, a former federal prosecutor who had spent the later years of his career working on financial fraud cases and who had agreed to advise on the legal education component of what Emily was building. And the fifth was Victoria Harrington. Emily had asked her last, not because she was least important, but because she was most important, and Emily had needed to think carefully about what she was asking. She was not asking her mother to save her again. She was not asking her to step in front of a problem. She was asking her to sit beside her as an equal, as a co-builder, as the woman whose name would be on the door alongside Emily's own, because the work they had done together over the past 3 months had shown Emily with a clarity that left no room for doubt that her mother was the person she most wanted in the room when the room mattered. Victoria had looked at her for a long moment when Emily asked. "You understand this is a significant commitment," she said. "I do," Emily said. "And you understand that I will not tell you what to do," Victoria said. "This is your foundation. I will advise. I will support. I will use every contact and every piece of knowledge I have to help you build it well. But the decisions are yours." "I know," Emily said. "That's exactly what I need." Victoria nodded once. "Then yes," she said. The board meeting lasted 3 hours and covered more ground than Emily had expected, which told her that the people she had chosen understood what she was trying to build and were ready to build it. They argued productively about scope and focus and the sequencing of programming. They identified the partnerships that would be most valuable in the first year. They agreed on a model that combined direct financial education with one-on-one coaching, legal referrals, and a specific program Thomas had proposed that he called Financial Visibility, a structured curriculum to help women understand the complete financial reality of their households, the assets, the structures, the access points, the things they had a right to know and that people like Alexander kept deliberately obscure. When the meeting ended and the room was emptying, Carol came to stand beside Emily. "How do you feel?" she said. "Like we haven't started yet," Emily said. "Like everything we just did is necessary, but none of it is the thing itself." Carol smiled. "That's how you know you're ready," she said. "The impatience is the sign." Across the city, at approximately the same hour that Emily's board meeting was concluding, something else was happening that Emily would not learn about until the following morning. The regulatory referral the judge had made following the final hearing had been moving through the appropriate channels with the unhurried deliberateness of institutional process, and that process had now produced its first formal action. A federal investigation into the financial structures of Alexander Whitmore's offshore holdings had been opened. It was not public yet. It would not be public for several more weeks when a brief announcement would appear in the financial press in language so precise and restrained that most people would need to read it twice to understand what it meant. But it had begun. Emily found out from a former colleague of her mother's who was still connected to that world and who sent Victoria a brief message that Victoria forwarded to Emily the next morning without comment. Emily read it at the kitchen table. She sat with it for a moment. She thought about what it meant for Alexander, the investigation, the scrutiny, the slow unraveling of a structure he had spent years building with the specific intention of making it unassailable. She thought about what it meant for the people who had worked within that structure, the employees of his companies, the investors who had trusted him, the institutions that had done business with him based on a picture of his finances that did not accurately reflect reality. She did not feel triumph. She had expected to feel something closer to triumph than this, and its absence surprised her. What she felt instead was something she could only describe as completion. The sense that the arc of something had reached its natural end, that a story which had needed to be told had been told not by her, but by the facts themselves, which were patient in exactly the way that truth tends to be patient, willing to wait, however long it takes for someone to stop looking away. She called Victoria. "I saw it," Victoria said when she picked up. "Are you surprised?" Emily asked. "No," Victoria said. "This is where it was always going. Once the court record was established, this was the next logical step. The system doesn't always work, and it doesn't always work quickly, but when you give it something solid to work with, it tends to move in the right direction eventually." "Eventually," Emily said. "Yes," Victoria said. "Eventually is not always satisfying, but it is real." Emily looked at her notebook on the table, the one she had been using to map the Foundation's first programming year. "I've been thinking about the name," she said. "The Foundation." "Harrington Whitmore," Victoria said. "Yes," Emily said. "Someone asked me yesterday whether it bothered me keeping Whitmore in the name, whether I wanted to distance myself from it." "What did you tell them?" Victoria said. "I told them that the name is part of the story," Emily said. "That the Foundation exists because of everything that happened, not despite it, and that using both names is the most accurate way to describe what it is. It's the work my mother raised me to be capable of, and it's the experience I lived through that showed me it was necessary." Victoria was quiet for a moment. "That's the right answer," she said. "I learned from you," Emily said. "You improved on what you learned," Victoria said, "as you always have." The Foundation's first event was a 2-day workshop held in April, 6 weeks after incorporation, titled Understanding Your Financial Reality, a workshop for women in transition. It was not heavily marketed. They had capacity for 40 participants, and the spots were filled within 72 hours of a quiet announcement through Carol's network at Second Floor and through Dr. Okafor's academic contacts. Emily led the first session herself. She stood in front of 40 women ranging in age from their late 20s to their early 70s, and she talked about financial structures in plain language, the way she had always believed complex things should be explained, not simplified but clarified. She talked about joint accounts and separate assets and the ways that control of financial information can be used to create dependency. She talked about what to look for, what questions to ask, what documents to request, and how to request them. She talked about the difference between knowing something is wrong and being able to demonstrate it, and why that difference matters, and how to close it. She talked from her own experience without making it the center of the room, the way a person can use what happened to them as a tool for illuminating something larger without turning their pain into a performance. The room was completely quiet when she spoke. Not the polite quiet of an audience being respectful. The specific, concentrated quiet of people who are hearing something. They recognize something that corresponds to an experience they have been trying to name without having had the right words for it. After the first session, a woman in her early 60s named Margaret came to find Emily during the break. She was a well-dressed woman with careful posture and the particular containment of someone who has spent many years managing how much of herself she allows to be visible in public. She said her name, and she said she had been married for 34 years, and she said she had come to the workshop because her daughter had sent her the link, and she had almost not registered because she wasn't sure she was ready. She said, "I didn't know I had a right to understand the finances. He always handled everything. I thought that was just how it was." Emily looked at her. "You have every right to understand them," she said. "You always did, and it's not too late to start." Margaret nodded once, the careful nod of someone who is taking in information that is both liberating and frightening, that opens a door they are not quite sure they are ready to walk through. "Stay for the afternoon session," Emily said. "We're going to talk about exactly where to start." Margaret stayed. Midway through the second day of the workshop, Thomas Garrett presented the Financial Visibility Curriculum for the first time in a live setting, and Emily sat at the back of the room and watched him explain the things he had once explained in a courtroom, restructured now for clarity and access, built for women who were not financial professionals and who needed to understand these things, not to become experts, but to stop being vulnerable to people who assumed they would never try to understand at all. How was good at it? He had a patient, methodical quality in front of the room that made complexity feel approachable rather than intimidating. And Emily watched the faces of the women in front of him and saw in real time the specific transformation that happens when someone is given information they needed and did not have the way. A person's posture changes the way their expression shifts from careful containment to something more alert, more present, more ready. She felt something watching it that she did not have an immediate word for. Then she found the word, pride. Not in herself exactly, in the room. In the 40 women who had come here on a Wednesday morning in April because something in their life had told them they needed to understand something they had been kept from understanding, and who were sitting here in chairs and taking notes and asking questions and refusing in the small and daily and absolutely consequential way that women have always refused the things they were told to accept, to remain ignorant of their own lives. She felt proud of every one of them. 3 months after the Foundation's first workshop, Alexander Whitmore's name appeared in the financial press in connection with the federal investigation that had been proceeding quietly since the judge's referral. The article was factual and brief, and used the kind of careful language that financial journalism uses when an investigation is active and conclusions have not yet been formally reached. But the information in it drawn from court records that were now public from Daniel Park's forensic report, which had been entered into the record from Thomas Garrett's testimony, painted a picture that was clear enough without requiring interpretation. Several of Alexander's institutional partners announced reviews of their relationships with his companies. 2 board members of his largest holding company resigned. His stock holdings, which had been stable for most of the preceding year, began a slow decline that the financial analysts attributed in the precise and hedged language of their profession to uncertainty surrounding the outcome of the regulatory review. Emily read about all of it from a distance. She had not looked for these stories. They had come to her the way things come to you when you have been part of something large through friends and colleagues and the general current of information that flows through a professional world. She read them with the attention of someone who wants to understand what is happening accurately and without drama, and when she finished reading each one, she set it aside and went back to the work she was doing. She had a foundation to run. She had 40 women from the first workshop and 60 more registered for the second and a third session being planned for the fall, with twice the capacity because the waiting list had grown faster than they had anticipated, and Carol had found them a larger space. She had a partnership with Dr. Okafor's university that would provide research support and academic validation for the curriculum Thomas had built. She had a conversation scheduled for the following week with the legal aid organization in Chicago that had reached out about potentially replicating the foundation's model in their city. She had, in other words, enough to do that. The story of Alexander Whitmore and what was happening to him occupied a smaller and smaller portion of her attention with each passing week, not because she was forcing herself to let it go, but because the thing she was building was large enough and real enough and demanding enough to fill the space that the story had once occupied. That was the best possible outcome, and she knew it. One afternoon in late June, 6 months after the final hearing, Emily sat at her desk in the Foundation's new offices, a modest but real space they had moved into the previous month, and she was reviewing the second-year programming plan when her phone rang and she saw that it was Victoria. She picked up immediately. "I want to tell you something," Victoria said, and there was something in her voice that was different from its usual register, a quality that Emily recognized as belonging to the moments when her mother allowed something through the professional composure that ordinarily governed how she presented herself to the world. "Tell me," Emily said. "I had lunch today with a colleague," Victoria said, "a woman I've known for 30 years. She's on the board of the National Coalition for Women's Financial Justice. They're convening in September. They want to know if you'll speak." Emily was quiet for a moment. "What kind of speaking?" she said. "The kind where they put your name on the program and the people in the room are the people who fund and lead the most significant women's advocacy organizations in the country," Victoria said. "The kind where what you say will reach further than this room, much further." Emily turned to look out the window of the office. She thought about 40 women in a conference room on a Wednesday in April. She thought about Margaret, who had called the foundation the following week to schedule a one-on-one coaching appointment, and who had called Emily personally after that appointment to say that she had requested for the first time in 34 years a complete accounting of the household finances, and that her husband had been very surprised, and that she had told him he would need to get used to it. She thought about that. She thought about the morning 6 months ago when she had stood in a courtroom with no lawyer at her table and pressed her feet against the floor and breathed and told herself she was still standing. "Tell her yes," Emily said. Victoria paused, and then she said in a voice that carried in it everything she had never said and everything she had always meant, "I already did." Emily laughed. It was a real laugh, the uncomplicated kind, the kind that arrives without announcement and is gone before you can analyze it, and it filled the office for a moment and then settled. "Of course you did," Emily said. "I know my daughter," Victoria said simply. They talked for a few more minutes about logistics and dates and the other things that accompany decisions like this, the practical details that are how real things get done. And when the call ended, Emily sat at her desk for a moment and looked at the room around her, the real physical permanent space that had been rented in the name of something she had built. And she thought about the morning 10 months ago when she had woken in a rental apartment with thin walls and pressed her feet against the floor because her mother had once told her that as long as you can feel the ground, you are still standing. She had felt the ground. She was still standing, more than standing. She had built something, not alone. She was clear-eyed about that in the way she was clear-eyed about everything now. She had built it with Thomas Garrett's courage and Carol Simmons's experience and Patricia Okafor's research and James Whitfield's knowledge and Victoria Harrington's 40 years of understanding exactly how power works and how to make it serve the right purpose. She had built it with the testimony of 40 women in a conference room and 60 more on a waiting list, and Margaret's voice on the phone saying, "For the first time in 34 years, I asked to see the accounts." She had built it from the architecture of her own experience, the years she had spent being invisible, the skills she had stored and not surrendered, the patience that had not been weakness, the quiet that had not been surrender, the endurance that had looked from the outside like stillness, but had been from the inside, the long and deliberate preparation of someone who was getting ready. Alexander Whitmore had looked at her across a conference table and across a courtroom and seen a woman who had nothing. He had been looking at a woman who had everything she needed and was just beginning to use it. And the proof of that was not in the settlement agreement, though the settlement agreement was real and fair and documented in language that acknowledged what was true. The proof of that was not in the regulatory investigation, or the stock decline, or the board resignations. Though all of those things were the natural and inevitable consequence of what happens when a structure built on concealment is finally and completely exposed to light. The proof of that was here, in this office, in this work, in the names of 60 women on a waiting list who needed to understand their own financial reality and who had found, because Emily Whitmore had built a place for them to find it exactly the right door. A woman who is underestimated does not need to announce her power. She needs only to use it patiently and precisely and in the right direction and let the work speak with the voice that matters most, the permanent, unsilenceable, unimpeachable voice of something real that stands long after the people who doubted it have run out of things to say. Emily picked up her pen. She went back to work, and the foundation she built outlasted every lie he ever told.